Last week, we talked a bit about the troubled family histories of our ancestors in faith. That story that started with Abraham and Sarah a great many weeks ago ends today more or less with a reconciliation of Joseph and his brothers, though there was a lot of stories in between Joseph being thrown in a well and sold into slavery, and today when he's the second-ranking person in all of Egypt. It is a long arc with lots of difficult moments. And perhaps the resolution in today's story points to what God wants to do with all of our conflicts, family and otherwise. Reveal a reconciliation that restores life, that nourishes, that begins something new. It might be easy to explain away these difficult stories and consign them to the more ancient text of the Hebrew Bible. They are more mythic stories, after all, of patriarchs and matriarchs, and later the rulers of Israel, especially King David and his very troubled family. Alas, today's gospel confronts us with, well, a story that appears to have Jesus himself not at his very best, at least from our perspective. Today he seems every bit in the grip of his own version of ethnocentrism that marked the relationships between Canaanites and Israelites all the way back into the stories of the Hebrew Bible. And I don't think it's off the mark to assume that when Jesus says dogs in relation to this woman, he was using something like a vulgarity. In any event, this story does not cast Jesus in a favorable light, at least in my eyes, and even ancient hearers of this story would likely have found it at least uncomfortable. Jesus, the Good Shepherd, is nowhere to be found. But wait, dare we hope that this story is perhaps an invention? That maybe the gospel writer was trying to make a point that even if Jesus didn't know it yet, his gospel was really for everyone, including the Canaanites? Well, maybe. And it is always important to remember that the four gospels are all stories and teachings arranged to make a point about Jesus, not necessarily to tell the story as it happened. The point that he's the Messiah. For Matthew, the point that he's the fulfillment of Israel's law, the new Moses, or that he is the Son of God. We're not dealing with history here. I think we all know that, except we insist that Jesus did live and die and rise again. And the Gospels at least provide a broad sketch of his life. And some of what happened in these stories probably happened also in his life. There are scholars who try to figure out just how trustworthy as history some gospel stories are, and they all have some criteria for determining what actually happened. Or maybe it happened. My favorite is what's called the criterion of embarrassment. If the story casts Jesus or another character in a negative light, think Peter's betrayal, it probably happened and had to be included in the gospel because it was probably widely known and told among those ancient Christians, and it had to be dealt with. The most famous of these is Jesus' baptism by John, which suggests that John is the greater prophet and Jesus his successor. So every single gospel writer includes that story, each with that person's own unique take on what it means, and always with John himself insisting that no, Jesus is the greater one. Of course, in terms of our story today, we might be more embarrassed by it than our ancient Christian siblings. And the story doesn't have Jesus looking embarrassed at all. He doesn't say sorry or anything. But to the point, if you were introducing the stories of Jesus to someone unfamiliar with him, would you start by telling this story? I wouldn't. So why do we keep telling it? It's fine enough to acknowledge the obvious. By the time the Gospel of Matthew was written, there were many non-Jews that were joining the churches, that were joining the Christian movement. And we know that was a matter of some conflict. All you have to do is read Paul's writing about it, how many fights he had with the apostles in Jerusalem. So perhaps this very Jewish Gospel of Matthew needs a story that at least has Jesus acknowledging the possibility that the new Israel begun in him is not limited by the bounds of the first covenant. So Jesus recognized this woman's faith and heals her daughter. But what good is that to us now? One thing I cannot help but notice in this story is the fact that this woman has three characteristics that put her outside Jesus' imagination, outside what he thinks his mission is. She's a Canaanite, and so foreign to Jesus and really a traditional enemy of the Israelites. She is a woman, and so beneath him on account of her gender. And Jesus, of course, was as shaped by his own culture as we are ourselves. And finally, she is of a different religion. She may have well worshipped the king, Herod. She was not a Jew. These are all reasons for him in his own context to ignore her, even to insult her. After all, through most of Israel's history, the failure of the people was blamed on foreign women and their gods. Foreign women who corrupted the male leaders, especially the kings. Surely remember the story of Jezebel. And the prophetic writings are full of curses against such foreign women. But in this case, it is the foreign woman who is the prophet, not Jesus. She is the one speaking with the voice of authority. She is the one outwitting the rabbi with logic of her own and on his own terms. We sometimes speak of the sayings of Jesus, the parables, his teaching. But in this case, it is the saying of this foreign woman that speaks good news and even invites Jesus to his own conversion, to change his mind. The son of David gets schooled by a daughter of Canaan, shouting at him at the side of the road, shouting at him that her daughter's life matters, and her daughter's life should matter to him too. Why tell this story? For me this week, it is an embarrassing reminder of the limits I put on the voices that I allow to teach me. The voices that even now, God's speaking in with authority and power, maybe even shouting because I am so hard to get through to. I privilege Jesus and those who have come after him in the Christian tradition. I privilege people who look and sound like me, who share my color or speak my language. You know, I think it likely that those kinds of voices will simply confirm what I think I already know. And it is unlikely that they will invite me to change my mind in gospel ways. I may need to be embarrassed by someone shouting at me to make their voice heard. So I need this story to remind me, if it was good enough for Jesus, it is good enough for me. I hope I find myself as willing as he was to be, embarrassed by the good news I have not yet allowed myself to hear. What are the voices that each of us need to be listening for if we are to hear God's good news?